And we are live and audio's on. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Viral Transmissions. It's episode 9. We're about to start with the healthcare cheer, which hopefully we can hear from Katie's phone. I can hear my neighbor kids banging pots and pans, which they love to do. If we're lucky, we might also hear my downstairs roommate be assaulted in League of Legends and her responding dramatically as streamers do.
I think there's an ad happening right now on the Twitch stream.
Oh yeah, well
that's what I'm getting anyway.
That'll happen. Yeah. In fact.
Okay, here we go.
Yeah, that's why I normally started early, but we were having these technical difficulties. But there's some noise, I can hear it.
The Twitch. So there's the portrait view of Dr. Marshall's neighborhood and local pot banging. Knowledge years.
Did you hear that all right?
Yeah.
Yes.
That's good.
Thank you.
I'm feeling a good cheer today.
That was a good cheer, was it?
Mm-hmm.
We just heard one, I guess it was a pot. It was a distorted sound.
Yeah, I think it was a pot. It might have even been Katie, actually.
If there was more noises, I didn't hear them over the people outside my window.
Let's get
so it probably all just meshed together.
Yep. I use
great.
the lid of a Dutch oven, which is actually very resonant. It perfected my technique.
Nice.
Yes, it is.
Well, greetings, guys. Greetings, guys, gals, and non-binary pals. I'm Joe Fulgham. Welcome to Viral Transmissions episode number 9. Joining me as usual are Dr. Rob Tarzwell and Toren Atkinson. Our guest tonight is Dr. Katie Marshall, a comparative physiologist at the Department of Zoology at UBC. I believe we're going to talk about zoonosis. I hope I'm saying that right, which is the source of the disease if it jumps from an animal. That's kind of what that means. I didn't Google it for
and
some
a
reason.
caustic soda alumni.
Dr. Marshall would have
Yet another caustic soda alumni. Let me also mention, as it has been for the past couple of episodes, Viral Transmissions is supported in part by the BC Humanist Association. You can learn more about them. They're great at bchumanist.ca. All right. I think that's it. I think we've had all the ad rolls happen for anybody who might have joined late. Sorry for not starting up sooner. I try to do that so the ads happen before we start, because Twitch wants you to look at ads before you look at us. Take it away, Rob, if you'd like to lead the questioning again here.
Sure. Dr. Marshall, welcome to the show.
Hey. So exciting to be here.
It is. It's exciting to have you. So, for lots of folks in the audience are not from the caustic soda background, so may not know anything about you. You've got a pretty interesting niche within the world of biology. And maybe you could tell us a bit about your background, the kind of scientific work that you're doing. And start there.
I'm a member of the comparative physiology group in the Department of Zoology. Basically, that means we do all the physiology that has nothing to do with humans, which sounds like something that would not be useful in a viral epidemic. But as it turns out, COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes it, is a zoonotic disease, and most emerging infections are. So those are diseases that are transmitted from a vertebrate host to humans, and it may or may not then be transmitted among humans.
Plus, if the Tree of Life movie told me anything, it's that we're all connected, man. We're all connected.
We are all connected. Sometimes in wonderful, lovely ways, and sometimes through bat poop. Yeah. But so my own particular niche within that field is I'm interested in range expansion. So what sets the range boundaries for species? What can we learn through physiology for predicting where those might be or how they might change as climate changes? So there's kind of these sort of interesting relationships between understanding how animals, where they live and how big their population sizes get and what that means and for the diseases that they might carry.
Range boundary, the idea is you're over there, we're over here, and unless something happens within the global climate that affects us all, that's going to stay that way. But when the climate changes, then...
Yeah, so it works a lot of different ways, but fundamentally, everything has viruses, and as climate is changing really rapidly, things are moving around in a way that they never used to. And I would also say not just climate change, but in the case of a lot of mammalian species, all the stuff that humans do to muck with natural environments. So deforestation, building lots and lots of new cities and spots that used to be pristine, natural habitats. We're coming into contact with sort of an enormous variety of viruses that we never used to. So
what is a working hypothesis then about how this virus and us had our untimely meeting last November? Or so.
So there are many competing hypotheses. And so one thing I want to say off the bat, there have been since the end of December. Oh, sorry.
Saw what you did there off the bat.
Off the bat, yeah.
I think we found the name of our episode.
Oh, off the bat. I like it. So since the end of December, there have been something like 24,000 published scientific articles on SARS-CoV-2. The doubling time for the scientific literature in this is like 2 to 3 weeks, which is unprecedented on any topic. And I have not read all 24,000 of those papers. So, and I will also say with all those papers, a lot of them are in the pre-publication sort of press, so things like bioRxiv, medRxiv, so they haven't actually been peer reviewed. So you could go through those 23,000 papers and get all kinds of exciting, wonderful hypotheses for how this thing started. And some of them are going to be more plausible than others. So with all that set aside, there's kind of a couple of lines of evidence for what's happened. I think most people know hey, there was this wet market in Wuhan and a bunch of people there got sick and now we're all in lockdown is kind of the story that has been spread. And, and certainly certain aging Canadian pop stars have used it as a way of really sort of angrily shouting at certain groups of people. The problem is
onto the front page. Yeah.
yeah. The problem is that doesn't. The evidence for that is mixed at best. So
by that, what you mean is, and we made some references. Bryan Adams accused it from coming from people who ate bats.
Yeah, at a wet market. And there are multiple things wrong with that statement. Thing number one is that wet markets, probably all of us have been to a wet market. It's just where there's vegetables and animal, you could go to a fish market and that would be a wet market. Right. So it's just different than a dry market.
Would you say Granville Island has a wet market on it?
Yes.
Oh my God.
Okay,
I know.
So what makes it? So 10 weeks ago, I'd never even heard the phrase wet market, but now I hear it 3 times a day. So what is a wet market? I don't even know what that means.
So it's actually, the term came from Singapore from what I've read. And so basically it just refers to, think about fish being kept at a market. And what you see is it's usually on ice, right, to keep it cold. The ice melts. You get bits of water on the ground, right, because the ice melts. And all of a sudden you have wetness on the ground and that makes it a wet market. So that's
Oh.
literally it.
Yeah.
Floor is wet, market is wet.
Mhm.
Shoes get wet.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right.
The-
Okay, I
So-
may have. All right.
So
All right.
Yeah.
the Wikipedia little entry here says a wet market, also called a public market, is a marketplace selling fresh meat, fish produce, and other perishable goods as distinguished from dry markets that sell durable goods such as fabric and electronics. So most of the food markets I think that we would think of would pretty much classify as wet markets. It does say that not all wet markets sell live animals, but the term wet market is sometimes used to signify a live animal market in which vendors slaughter animals upon customer purchase. So some people might mean, oh, if you get your animal slaughtered there, that's a wet market. But the general
Right.
term literally just means, yeah, the stuff there is like food that could be moist, really.
Yeah. Yeah, it's perishable.
Yeah.
And so some wet markets are wildlife markets, and that I think is what most people are trying to refer to in this case. That the market in Wuhan was a wildlife market. Now,
So non-domesticated animals.
right.
Okay.
And so now that said, we're kind of like what Brian Adams tweeted is like an onion of wrong, and there's like multiple layers that you have to kind of work your way through.
It's the alternate title for our episode.
Brian
Onion
Adams,
of
the
wrong.
onion of wrong.
Right. So the other thing that's important to know about this is that from what I've read, bat eating is not something that people in that area do. And if you actually look at the bats that have the closest match to this virus, there are a species, so the horseshoe bats, which is also what the source of SARS was, COVID, the original.
Toronto SARS, yeah.
Yeah, Toronto SARS. So horseshoe bats are what's called a microbat. So they're like 4 to 28 grams in size. They're really small. So yeah, so imagine like a pack of cards. Like it is 1/4 of the weight of a pack of cards.
Okay.
Like I'm no expert, but that ain't good eating where I'm from. Like that really is not.
I mean,
Okay,
unless you ate them like
boosh, really.
unless you ate them like popcorn chicken, right? Just little
Maybe
crunchy bats. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. So that's another problem. I think bat eating is something that does happen in like some areas, but it's not particularly common there. Another issue is that way back when all of this was going down, there was a lot of sampling of the market environment and the animals in the market to see, okay, do we see SARS-CoV-2 there? And it was found in sort of the general environment. It wasn't found in any of the animals in the market. So one of the going hypotheses is that there actually was an ongoing spread of this before it hit the market. And if you actually look at the cluster of the first 41 cases that were identified, several of them were not people who worked at the market. And so the kind of classic story we've been told about this whole, or not we've been told, but it sort of emerged through the media, and I think a lot of people sort of understood, was that there was some bat at the market that people took home and ate, and the bat had the coronavirus, and now we're all locked down. But it could have been
popular story, yeah.
Yeah,
but it could have been.
Could have been it. I mean, an equally likely story. There's a couple of options. One of the things to also know is that some of the ways that people have been unraveling this whole thing is by looking at the sequence of the virus that's found in humans and looking at other viruses in other animals. So this is genetic epidemiology, which I find super fascinating. And what's interesting is that, okay, so bats have tons of viruses. Bats are full of coronaviruses, like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds have been identified. There's probably more we don't know about. One thing to know in general, I don't know if you know this, but there are more types of viruses on planet Earth than there are stars, like in the galaxy. Like it's enormous. So yeah, they're everywhere. And so one of the weird things is, if you look at the closest known genetic sequence for SARS-CoV-2 with a horseshoe bat, it's actually from Yunnan province. and Wuhan is in Hubei. So, and I may be butchering the pronunciation there, but that's like a distance of like 1,400 kilometers. So, yeah. Yeah.
So it's like a market. So it's as if I got sick at Granville Island Market from a virus that appears to originate in Moose Jaw.
Yeah.
Saskatchewan. That won't mean much to our American viewers.
Yeah.
What would put that into relevant terms? You go to a market in LA. In LA, and the virus is like from Chicago. Well, maybe not quite that far east, but in that range.
Well, it's all miles. Things are confusing in the U.S. I don't understand.
Right.
So the other sort of way to look at this is that there are actually several coronaviruses that have been identified in pangolin. And kind of the weird thing about the bat that was found is it's a pretty good match overall, but it's real bad at the receptor binding domain of the virus. Like that is the important bit. That's the bit that like grabs out to your receptors and says, hey, let me in. And if that isn't a match, right, like that's just not going to work real well for infecting humans. Now, where you find a really good match at the receptor binding domain is in pangolins, which like, yeah, we got bats, we got pangolins, and pangolins were not at that Wuhan market, at least in the official lists. They are really commonly illegally traded for Chinese traditional medicine. So it may be that they were there and just not reported because it was in the illegal trade because they're threatened.
So pangolins fell off the back of a truck.
Yeah, pangolins off the back of a truck. Yep, entirely possible.
Roll off like balls.
Yeah. So really, we have a couple of scenarios. It could have been that the virus had already, people had gotten it already from bat guano. So the virus is shed a lot in guano. If you read some of the papers on like identifying coronaviruses from bats, it's all about the anal swabs. So I won't, probably less uncomfortable than a nasal swab, I would imagine.
There's only one way to find out.
In human stool, at least viral RNA is present in human stool as well. So this is not unprecedented.
No, and the interesting thing about guano is it's actually mined, right? It's really, really useful for fertilizer, for instance. And so, but it's also an ingredient in some types of Chinese traditional medicine.
Oh, wow. Okay. So there's potentially a number of entry points, I think, is what
exactly.
I hear you say. So it could have been a sick worker who goes to the market, who got it elsewhere, or a sick customer of the market who goes to the market. And of course, a market is where there's all sorts of people who are crowded. And boom, one
could have been a very evil bat and pangolin working together.
Yeah, exactly. The other sort of unknown thing, right? So what we know from other coronaviruses like SARS and MERS is that they required an intermediate host. So before they became infectious to people. So civet cats for SARS, MERS was camels. And they actually think that MERS, for instance, evolved for a long time in camels before it made the jump. It's actually called a spillover event into humans, which it just sounds like kind of evil. I just imagine a movie spillover event, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do cry over
So when the hump gets too full, it starts sloshing out the top. It's a camel spillover event.
Yeah.
Sloshing out the top.
So the other kind of unknown thing is, was it that the virus first came into humans and evolved for a while in humans and developed the ability to infect human-human transmission, or did it actually like evolve for a while in let's say a pangolin before it made its way over to humans? There's basically the exact sort of what happened along the way is really unclear. And the latest paper I read was published the end of April and was said we really can't tell right now how exactly that all went down. So yeah. So the onion.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So we don't know the origin of the story.
Exactly.
We just have a few tantalizing hypotheses.
Mm-hmm.
Tantalizing isn't the word.
And we
could
may
be we
never
never
know.
do, but I'm curious. Like, what are the chances of us finding out 100%?
Well, so when you're trying to do this kind of work, like you're basically what you're doing is you're finding coronaviruses, right, in lots of animals all over the place. And you're also trying to find it from human samples. And you're trying to reconstruct, based on like the mutations that have happened in the virus over time, what was the route by which, right, that virus started in probably in a bat and ended up in people. And it may be that those samples just don't exist, right? Like either the virus has mutated too much. Some of the like the estimates for the divergence time between the bat virus that was found in Yunnan and the human version of coronavirus was something like 20 to 25 years of evolution. So that's a long time for a lot of bats to die and potentially never give us their exciting anal swabs. So, sorry.
I didn't know you found anal swabs exciting. Okay.
Well, when they potentially become kind of the thing that keeps me from that means that I have a week to prepare my new online class that I'm now teaching. And actually, like, it actually amazes me, right? This whole thing is because of like messed up bat immunology, right? Like, so bats are this like massive reservoir of viruses. And so there's been a lot of interest since SARS trying to figure out why. Like, what is up with the bats? Do they just hate us? Is it something special about them? And so I know, I feel bad because bats are amazing. They provide really important services like mowing down on mosquitoes. So that's really important.
The number one killer from
mosquitoes.
The entire animal kingdom.
The deadliest
Learned
animal.
That on caustic soda, yeah.
That's right. So bats are really important for controlling mosquito populations. They also, fruit bats pollinate, which is really great. So, so the best evidence we've got is bats are physiologically really weird mammals. They're really, really diverse. So about 20% of all mammal species are bats. They live in really, really large colonies, which means that diseases can transmit really easily amongst bats. So they're kind of like humans, right? They live in these like really small or really sort of confined spaces. The other weird thing about bats, so they're the only mammal that fly. And the other thing that's been noted with bats is they live a really long time. So 7 to 8 years for like a little micro bat, maybe up to 20, 30 years, I think is the longest known bat lifespans.
Yeah, I just looked that up. Typical lifespan is 6 or 7 years for a horseshoe bat, but one greater horseshoe bat lived more than 30 years.
Yeah. And so this is weird because usually the smaller the animal, the smaller the mammal, the shorter the lifespan. So a mouse, like a couple of years at best, right? If things go well for that mouse. Things like us, we tend to have pretty long lifespans. Elephants, long lifespans, bigger the mammal, the longer it lives. Bats are a huge exception to that rule. And the thought is it's because they fly.
I was going to say the same thing. Life is worth living when you can fly. That's all. Yeah. Every other, the smaller you are, the more you're just eventually going, ugh, I've just had enough. This is not worth it. And when you fly, you don't care that you're small. You fly. Sorry.
So the flying is flying is like metabolically really, really expensive. Like, if you want to get somewhere easy, right? What do? You slide on the ground.
You're a pangolin, you roll down a hill.
Roll down a hill. I mean, maybe the pangolins are just jealous of the bats. Possible. But to fly is like a huge, huge amount of metabolism that has to happen. And as a byproduct of all that metabolism, you get things like reactive oxygen species and like things that can generally cause inflammation. Now, the interesting thing is bats, because they live in these big colonies, they have to be pretty good at managing viruses because, big colonies, lots of transmission. They are not physically distancing ever or socially distancing or, any of that. And so their antiviral response is really, really good, but their inflammatory response has actually been dampened. And so they think that actually leads to the longer longevity, but also the ability to just kind of like hang on to viruses, not really be affected by them. And so they become a really effective reservoir of viruses. So
it's like they made a deal.
We won't bother you.
Yeah. It's like they made a deal with the virus. Listen, we'll be your reservoir. We won't kick you out with our antiviral properties. We'll maybe spread you somewhere else, and you leave us alone. Deal? And the virus went, all right, fine. That's fine. We'll tell all our viral friends to join you as well.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's exactly how that went.
Totally, right? Viruses talk. It's just science.
It's just organized into letters that the of course the bats in this scenario can read.
Yeah. Little miniature tiny letters.
You look down at your belly and it's pushing out things to communicate with you.
Oh, that's horrifying.
Little
I know, I'm
emojis.
turning this into a horror movie. I'm sorry.
Oh God.
Body horror gets me too. That would be terrible.
We look at the bigger picture. There have been a few nasty or potentially pretty nasty pandemics. This one is arguably the nastiest in a century. There seems to be an accelerating pace of these things. So we look at SARS 2003, H1N1 2009, MERS 2015-ish, and now here we are, SARS-CoV-2 2020, or well, COVID-19 2019. Put on your comparative physiology hat and tell and give me some sense of why are we looking at this accelerating pace of viral pandemics?
I wish I had the answer to that. I can tell you that there have been people who are really, really interested in this who have written very, very long articles outlining a bunch of reasons. One is that, and one of the things that I've been interested in studying is range expansion of the hosts. So in general, I mentioned that all of these diseases, right, that have become these big pandemics are all zoonotic diseases, right? They are all diseases that come from animals. And so one thing that is probably happening with climate warming is range expansion of the animal host. So in general, most species are, you can kind of think of like at their poleward range edge, it's the cold that knocks them back. And at the equatorward range edge, it's the warm that knocks them back. And one of the things that's been happening with climate change is actually the winters that drive that poleward range edge are getting warmer. And so you can kind of think of this as like the range of where an animal could live on like a map. The winters are getting warmer, so that's expanding and expanding. The summers are getting a little bit warmer, but it's not near as much as the winter. And so that mismatch is causing asymmetric range edge change, is what kind of the us nerds in the literature would call it. But basically
animals are creeping north and south from the...
It's changing the Goldilocks zone for viruses.
Well, it's not the viruses, right? It's the hosts that carry the viruses that really matter. And so we're expecting range expansion of lots of exciting disease vectors like malaria mosquitoes into Canada and further north. So that's Lyme disease that is carried by ticks, and those are expanding. But with that, there's also really big changes in the way, in the amount of like deforestation and other habitat disturbances that we're doing. So we're just coming in contact more with animals. In other cases, some of the thoughts behind what's driven like the expansion of Lyme disease, for instance, in North America, is killing off the predators of deer. And so the deer populations explode, and then that allows for Lyme disease to become much, much more common. So in general, there's kind of a few different things that can happen to drive these emerging infectious diseases. One is that the host becomes more, has a wider range. Another, the host population becomes bigger, allowing for greater spread of the virus, and also potentially more mutations in any given disease, right? Because the population is bigger. And then thirdly, there could actually be changes to the infectivity of the virus or the particular disease we're talking about itself. And so one of the interesting things that's been studied is, so if you actually look in North America, one of the interesting zoonotic diseases we have is hantavirus. So it's carried by a lot of mice, spread by, we can get it by from their droppings or urine. The ranges of those mice have been spreading. The populations of those mice have been increasing because the winters are less harsh. But also there's this interesting relationship between kind of the stress that those organisms experience. And so with habitat destruction, often that actually seems to be driving some of the ability for the mice to like harbor that infection or fight it off. And so that's actually getting back to the wildlife market. One of the hypotheses for why wildlife markets are really important places for spillover events is that the animals there are stressed. So their immune systems are suppressed and their amount of viral shedding goes up. So,
okay.
Yeah. So basically, we're messing with everything. I mean, I don't think you needed me to tell you that, but yes. So.
Okay. We have a question in chat, which I think you and I have talked about before, not this specifically, but will we talk about gain of function research lab as a possible source? And I think that you've told me that we're pretty sure that this virus was not genetically engineered. Do you want to talk about that, how we know that?
Yeah, so there's a couple of good papers out there that specifically looked at this because, I mean, that's been kind of one of the hypotheses, right, for where this whole thing came from. Mm-hmm. One of the interesting lines of evidence for it not being a gain of function thing is that looking at that receptor binding domain. So how exactly, cat, sorry.
Range expansion.
Yeah, range expansion. So the receptor binding domain, right, is that bit of the spike protein that attaches to our ACE2 receptors. Now, I've been known to simplify all of biology to receptor binding. It's super, super important. It drives like how our cells talk to each other. It drives like whether or not we get infections. It drives how hormones work. Receptors are kind of the big thing. And people who are interested in like drug design, for instance, are really interested in whether or not their particular drug is going to bind to a receptor that might be specific to either a cell type or a type of cancer. Like it's kind of a way of targeting, right? If you give a drug everywhere in the body, you want to be able to target to a specific thing that expresses a specific receptor. Mm-hmm. And so all of this is kind of a way of saying we've got really good computational models for predicting any given protein, whether it's going to bind to any given receptor. And so what researchers did is they actually ran the spike protein from SARS-CoV-2 through some of these models and said, okay, how good is this spike protein at actually binding to our ACE2 receptors? And the answer is, according to all the computational models, it's crap. Like it really shouldn't work at all. And it turns out when you do this in vitro, it does a real good job of binding to those receptors. So what that kind of suggests is that if someone had tried to engineer this virus based on everything we know about receptor binding, they would not have chosen this.
Right.
So that's, yeah.
According to all of the tools that they use, according to the knowledge that they would use to decide how to engineer something to do this, they would not know that this would work that well because in the models, it just doesn't. So that alone says like that somebody didn't create this. Yeah, I get that. That like if your building blocks don't make your toy car work, you're not going to build a toy car that way, even if one randomly happens that does work that way. It would have to do the random thing first. Wasn't a great metaphor, but yeah.
No, it's like, why would you stick like triangular shaped tires on your car? Like you just wouldn't do that, right? So
okay, so they ask a follow-up, not asking if it was engineered, but if it could have been discovered there and accidentally released.
Yeah, so that is another hypothesis. And I think even the leader of the lab had said, hey, maybe that could have happened. So there's a really big virology lab in Wuhan. And so the hypothesis has been, okay, this was, people are studying bat coronaviruses. Maybe, it was just an accidental lab escape. And those accidental lab escapes have happened on occasion. So people working in labs have gotten infected with like SARS, for instance. That seems unlikely because, and obviously because this was a concern, they looked at all the sequences of all the viruses that they keep in that lab, and there's just nothing that really looks like it.
Right.
So it seems unlikely. You can't entirely, say 100%, but, from the best evidence we have, it doesn't seem to be the case.
Right. There could be some really weird edge case where some researcher brought in a new bat that had this in it and was doing something and hadn't yet entered it into the database and then came home with it or so. Yeah, that kind of thing is possible, but very unlikely. I would think that also by studying the first, I think you said they know the first 41 or so people infected, that they would also know if those people had a link to that lab, right? Like if they had contacted a researcher there or worked there themselves. And I wouldn't put it past China to try to suppress that, but I think there's also just so much pressure to get that info that if there was something fishy there, we'd know it by now. That's how I think about it.
the other thing to keep in mind too is that not only is there kind of the Chinese government, but there's also Chinese researchers and Chinese doctors, right? And some of them have gone in harm's way, right, to actually try and, bring news of this out here. There was that, I forget his name, the doctor who died, who was that? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the government is one thing, but I would say the people are another. And, I would really be surprised. I'm sure at least one scientist out there would be like, hey, we think, and even to have the director of the lab say, hey, that was a possibility, right? Like, they're doing their best to kind of be upfront about that. So
Yeah. I say this about things when arguing with anti-vaxxers and things like that. Like, okay, there are evil people in the world who might come up with some kind of plot to do something horrible like what you're suggesting, but there's no way it would ever get pulled off because everybody that they have to get involved in the plot is a scientist who got into health because they care about health and actually want to help people. And yet they are still like vaccinating their own children and telling their families to get vaccinated and all that other stuff. So no, it's not a tracking device. It's not going to give you a disease. It just wouldn't work. You can't like organize 12 people into a conspiracy without it eventually leaking, much less worldwide scientists and medical experts. And we're seeing, like you said, in China, where even though China is this oppressive state, that the scientists are speaking up anyway about the truth. Yeah.
And I was gonna say too, like I don't know if you've ever tried to like get 3 or 4 faculty like scientists to like agree on anything. I have hours of the past week spent on Zoom.
The one thing we can agree on, Karen, is you're wrong.
No, but I'm pretty sure that we covered a few duels that were involved in scientists who disagree in the past on caustic soda, where no, this was a dinosaur. No, it wasn't. It was a bird. Or can't even remember what the details were, but I am certain that various scientists have come to blows over things like that.
Yeah, and I even want to just say with the papers that I was talking about and some of the things I was talking about, I mean, there is like dueling papers all over this literature, and like keeping up with it, that would be a full-time job in itself. So, I am just presenting things as they were presented in those papers. But the kind of awkward thing about this whole thing is like all of you are kind of seeing that messy, gross science making process. It's kind of like making a sausage, except like more expensive and like more persnickety, I think, in the writing. And it may be that 6 months down the line that this is entirely right, like something, that all of this is being thrown out and we know something different now, right?
Yeah.
So this
is that proportional belief that I talk about sometimes, coming head to head with our desire to have just a simple "this is the answer" kind of solution that we humans love to have. Oh, it was this one simple thing. Please tell us what it is. Whereas science is about come with a whole bunch of hypotheses about what it could be. And people hear these hypotheses, which are not theories, which are not proven. They're just like, well, maybe it's this. And that's maybe it's this is a perfectly healthy, good thing to do. But you can't take maybe it's this and then make conclusions based on that until you actually solve whether or not it actually was that. And yeah, we're seeing that messy. What is it? What could it be? We're trying to figure it out. It's not all the cards have hit the table. You can't possibly tell what hand you've got yet. Like this game is so wild that we might be throwing away some of the cards we've got, as you've noticed. Sorry, I keep putting it into game terms because that's how my brain works.
No, for sure. I will say, like, even Ebola, like, it's been out there for a long time, and I think we still don't know exactly what the root of transmission was, right? So, it may or may not be something we learn the answer to. Hopefully that it's come up so fast. That means that it's more likely that we'd be able to actually track it back, but it's possible we might not ever know. So that's something that makes me sort of sad, but yeah.
As long as we figure out what to do about it now that it's here.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is the important thing. And to prep for the next one. As you said, Rob, like we're getting more and more of these, and they're worse and worse over time. Like this should be the wake-up call to humanity, like that this is, we have the advantage that does not actually aerosolize. right? Like
It
right
should be the
now.
wake-up call, but we're seeing what's happening.
Yep.
No.
Yeah, the
We'll
next one
say,
could be worse.
like China, for instance, right, with banning some of the wildlife trade, that's a big step.
Mhm.
And that's really important. So if there's anything we know is that most of these things are going to come from wildlife. Now, that said, there are certainly, we do already manage quite a lot of zoonotic disease from farmed animals, right? Like I grew up near Walkerton. I was there during the water crisis. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just
Like
explaining
that.
sand cable to someone the other day, and they couldn't believe that there could possibly be someone that incompetent
Oh, yeah.
I don't know about this. Can
managing
you give
water
us a
purification. Oh, well, to do a bit of a diversion, yeah. So in Walkerton, in about 1998, there was some E. coli that got into the water from basically cattle ponds, sewage ponds.
Feedlots. Yeah.
And it was a particularly toxic form of E. coli that was quite fond of human kidneys. And a few people died. A lot of people got sick. A lot of them,
A
people got
couple of
permanently
thousand, I
injured.
think.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
bad. And the head of the water management plant at the time admitted, frankly, to drinking on the job, to
No training whatsoever
having
in
had no
managing water
training,
supplies.
right, to handling water samples inappropriately, to handling control samples inappropriately, to handling testing reagents inappropriately, like every wrong thing that you could do, he more or less admitted to. Hey, you know what? Maybe managing a water supply is a kind of a tedious job, but it's one of those tedious jobs that actually is really critical. If you don't notice the day that the sample in the vial turns purple and purple is bad, then you got a big problem.
yeah.
And that's kind of what happened. And it took a couple of years to actually clean up the water supply, trace it back to those cattle ponds. So yeah, if you grew up near Walkerton, you know all about that. Yeah, so it doesn't have to be something that happens far, far away or in the middle of the
No.
jungle.
Well, and that particular strain, I think it's 0157 H7 E. coli.
Yeah.
It causes, thousands of infections in North America every year, right? So
Yeah,
zoonotic
not usually
disease
in
is
one town though.
no. But this is just it. Zoonotic disease is everywhere, and it is something that we manage a lot, right? Like all those rules about like how cattle sewage is dealt with, right? And how waterways have to be protected. Like that's not just for, sort of hippie environmental reasons. That's for reasons of public health, among other things. So,
Right.
Yeah, no. So it's a kind of thing where, I'm a little terrified when I think about all the viruses out there, but, only a few hundred of them are really a problem for us. So that's pretty good odds, all things considered.
Well, who knows what's out there just waiting to take a
Oh, I know people who work in like looking at avian viruses, right? Like they go to, Central and South American jungles, they catch a bunch of birds, they take blood samples. It is kind of terrifying. Like it's just everywhere. I've seen studies on and actually presentations on sampling where like waterfowl overwinter in like Canada's north. And like it's just a layer of bird poop, and you sample in there and there are all these exciting influenzas. So yeah, basically the world is huge and full of viruses, and they all just want to replicate.
It's dark and full of terrors. The world is huge and full of viruses.
Yeah.
You heard it here
Exactly.
first.
Yeah.
So we got a couple more questions in the chat. We got a keener student of yours here in the chat.
Ooh.
Yeah. CD 29481. I have a question for Dr. Marshall. I'm one of her students in her online course, and I have a question about the mechanism of how COVID-19 could cause blood vessels to become swollen, and I assume trigger hemostasis, which has been found to be the case relatively recently.
So we have the circulatory system coming up in class this week. I think I'm going to have to go into some detail that we're just not going to be able to get to in class. So the thing about what COVID-19 actually binds to is ACE2. That's angiotensin converting enzyme 2. So we have angiotensin converting enzyme and angiotensin converting enzyme 2. So two of these things. Now, what you have to kind of realize is that ACE, so the first one, number one, it actually creates active angiotensin, and that's really important for increasing blood pressure. Your body wants to increase your blood pressure because your body has all these mechanisms in place. If you have like a big cut and you're bleeding out, your body is going to have to like hang on to all the blood it can, increase blood pressure, and try and manage that hypovolemia. So ACE, super important. But your body also has kind of an opposing mechanism. That's ACE2. And ACE2 converts angiotensin, what the first thing makes, into a different form of angiotensin. It's 1,7, but basically it acts as a vasodilator. So these ACE2 receptors that I talked about, they're in your alveoli for sure. And that's why like we get that pneumonia and all those sort of lung issues. But they're also on all the smooth muscle around all your blood vessels. Because, right, like if you have angiotensin, you're going to need a way to shut that stuff off. And that's what ACE2 is for. So we think that it's possibly the effect of angiotensin 1,7 that is driving some of these really interesting cardiovascular or circulatory system, I should say, effect. That ACE2 is, right, by kind of being that receptor, there's this like weird downregulation or upregulation of ACE2 that happens as part of the viral process. It's also like a route of entry, right, for the virus. The other places ACE2 is found is in your kidney or small intestine, I should say. So that's why we think some of the like digestive system things have been happening. And also cerebral cortex, which they think is what's driving the issues with anosmia, like lack of smell. So by mucking with like your blood pressure system, like that seems like a really good way to explain some of these circulatory system issues. Again, it's a new virus, lots we don't know. But that's actually, there's been a suggestion that ACE inhibitors people on ACE inhibitors have actually been doing better when they have COVID-19. And the thought is that the ACE inhibitors are actually downregulating ACE2, and so you're less likely to get it. Or no, sorry, the opposite. So it's actually upregulating it, and then you get that like vasodilation. It's, yeah. Right. Basically, your body is like all interconnected and trying to do all the things all simultaneously.
Right. So normally your body's balancing, depending on your needs, ACE and ACE2 with these two different switches. So COVID-19 connects to the switch that turns off the ACE1 that creates the thing that doesn't increase your blood pressure. And so we're talking about using the drug that then also slightly turns off the ACE1 creator so that they're kind of equal again. Both suppressed but equal, I guess is the way to say it. Okay, that makes sense to me.
Yeah, it's a weird, again, it's, it's all very hypothetical at this point, but that they think, so ACE2 are, right, they're found in all these different tissues, and so because you need to be able to vasodilate in lots of places. So, yeah. Yeah. Hope that answers the question.
It does to me. And I'm dumb, and I'm not one of your students. No Woo.
My students are scary smart, for sure.
No Woo asks, I wonder if by distancing for COVID-19, we're unintentionally eradicating any other less robust, less noticeable viral diseases that just happen to be getting transmitted out there all along. I'm pretty sure that the flu and the cold have been really hit hard by all of the things that we've done, just the regular things like that. XKCD had a cartoon a week or so ago which was basically the cold talking to humans and going, hey, can you stop with that hand washing thing? Like, we're really not getting anywhere because of it.
Yeah, absolutely. The other piece I wanted to say, it was the other kind of hat, unless you've got another question, but there has been the claim laid out there that this will all go away in the warm weather. And certain leaders of large countries to our south have said this, for instance. And so I just wanted
Mexico? You're talking about Mexico, right?
Yeah. The one with So there was actually a couple of studies that really made the rounds. I think it was in like February, early March, that basically compared a bunch of cities in China and then looked at the reproductive number. So that's like for every given person who has the virus, what's the average number of people they infect? And they were looking at it as a function of the climate of these different cities and saying, okay, right, like, these cities were warmer and they had a lower RO than these cities that were colder. Now, first off, the regressions were the kinds of things that make a statistician weep. So they were driven by like two outliers, right? So that it just didn't seem very legit. And the other issue was that, okay, maybe RO changed a little bit. It maybe went from like 2.8 to like 2.4. That's still a virus that can go exponential in its spread, right?
Yeah.
So maybe a little effect, but not enough to really knock it back enough to stop transmission. Mm-hmm. And so there's actually been a fight in my field where people have been like trying to do like species distribution modeling of SARS-CoV-2, and it just like violates all the assumptions of that. And yeah, so it's been like a huge knock them out, drag them out kind of fight in the like species distribution modeling literature about whether or not you should be doing this. And the consensus seems to be no, because really it seems like spread is really driven by social interactions. And when countries brought those different physical distancing efforts in, and also just contingency, like when did that first infectious person arrive to that country? So, and just in case you're curious, here in Canada, the vast majority of our infections have come from the US. So, yeah. Just wanted to put that out there. Sorry, Americans, you're lovely. You're kind of diseased.
Well, they are, but I also let's point out there are Canadians who are protesting the we talked about it before, who are protesting the lockdown, even though there's no lockdown. There's I'll just use the word fools. There are fools everywhere. So many things when it has to do with humans are just bell curves. And like, okay, America is slightly pushed more towards the foolish side of a bell curve, but that doesn't mean Canada doesn't have a significant amount under the boy, what a fool that is. And it doesn't.
It's just more Americans, right?
Yeah.
So the chances are that you're going to have a group of people who are not really listening to scientific evidence. Is
and
probably just
sometimes that misinformation can spread virally. So, and you get enough people into a clump and they just start to believe what everybody else in their clump believes. And then you have a whole bunch of people who believe horrible, damaging misinformation. Yeah.
We have a pandemic of scientific literature explosion. We have a pandemic of misinformation. Yeah. And also, I think we have a pandemic, I think XKCD also had comics on a pandemic of like bad epidemiological modeling by people who don't do epidemiology. So, yeah. So when I say this argument has been in my field, basically we're all saying we're not epidemiologists, right? Like we really shouldn't be touching this because that's not how viruses work. So,
yeah. So go ahead.
Oh, I think my favorite is the White House cubic model. Did you read about that?
It was literally a polynomial fit from Microsoft Excel. I saw that
you push the button in Excel and
So okay, I should also mention, right? This is a deep kind of divide in modeling. So there's the modeling where you have a bunch of data and you fit a curve to that. And that works real well for the data you've got. What it doesn't do well is predicting what's going to happen in the future. And so a good epidemiological modeling actually takes in some of what we know, some mathematical models of like how viruses spread. And it basically kind of splits up the population into like, people who are infectious, people who are susceptible, people who've recovered. And there's like various sort of iterations on that. But basically the relationship that it predicts does predict a leveling off once herd immunity has been reached, right? And you'll never get that from like just fitting to the data because the data don't necessarily get there. So that kind of mechanistic modeling is really important for this kind of thing rather than just curve fitting as a thing that you can do in Excel. I mean, I can't believe I have to say this, but yes, maybe.
Yeah.
At least don't do that if you're a university student handing in an assignment. Please don't do that. You can only do that if you're in charge of health policy for a massive wealthy nation.
Not if your grades depend on it.
Well, and there are certain things that it makes sense for. Like if you're trying to, describe the relationships between a couple of variables, that kind of linear fit is fine as long as you're not extrapolating beyond the data. But what we all want to know, right, are questions that are in the future. What's happening, what's next? It's not what's happened in the last couple of months. We want to know, what does June look like? What does July look like? And so to do that, we need good mechanistic models that actually capture some of the way that viral transmission happens.
Mm-hmm.
Look at that. I use a name of the podcast.
Nice. And some of those what's going to happen depend on what we decide to do. Like what happens in June if we open up one step of our opening up the economy? What happens in June to places that decide, well, that's it, we're done, it's going to be warm now and everything will be fine? What happens in June to places that are going to stay with social distancing and pay to keep people at home and only have essential workers? And I think the answer to all three of those is going to be wildly different. And thanks, neighbor. It's not time for making noise. I don't know if you can hear that car alarm going off. I think that's like the first way to kind of introduce the idea to people who don't get, these are multivariable things that we're trying to predict. And like, I'm just bringing up one, which is what do we do? And there's a whole bunch of other stuff involved. Like, I can't even get to
one of the things that these models are really useful though is actually getting at how sensitive are the outcomes to the different parameters. So for instance, here in BC, like we've been at like 10 to 30% of normal contacts, right? Like social contacts. And so what the modeling has shown is that number, like the percentage of our normal contacts is actually, we can expand on that quite a lot without the models going exponential. We can get all the way up to like 60% and be fine.
Oh, okay.
And so really what I think the use of modeling is for getting at, well, what are the things that we can change and how sensitive are the outcomes to those things that we change?
Mm-hmm.
So
I think what you're saying is I can get 60% of a haircut.
Yes.
Only
if you snuggle a pangolin while you're doing it.
That's kind of what I've been doing myself. It's the front 60% that I think this part I can do in the mirror, and then this part with two mirrors, I'm like, well, let me just not turn around. This is
pandemic mullets for everybody.
I've buzzed it up, but when it reaches the crown, where does it stop being longish? Like that's,
two mirrors is dangerous, man, because you move your hand like this, but in the mirror it's going like that.
Oh yeah. I mean, if we would my right hand is pretty good at mirror work, and then when I have to switch to the left, I'm like, this is backwards. I can't process it properly.
The struggle is real.
Why can't I touch my head? I can't even.
Yeah, exactly.
My hair's just getting long. That's just how it's going to be.
I basically have a mohawk is what I have, because buzzing the sides up to my part, just buzz that's fine. This is just, I trim it so it's not too long, and then there's a mess right here. I'm certain that this is a complete disaster, but nobody can see it. How's it going, everybody? Yeah.
Nicely.
I was going to say everything in my apartment's a mess except for this part where I lecture.
Nice.
I haven't even done that.
There's a giant rug with a giant pile underneath it, just off camera.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Off camera.
On top. Yeah. People will be able to look at all of the past viral transmissions and be like, he hasn't touched anything on that mini fridge in months. Yeah. It's true.
Nice.
That fridge hasn't been dusted since 92.
Yeah.
So, go ahead, Joe.
No, I was going to move on.
I was going to say, so we're kind of we're winding down, obviously. Are there any kind of final thoughts, messages that you want to impart to the infosphere?
Ooh, that is a lot of pressure. I'm not sure that I'm ready for that.
You don't have to have final words. It's
I think that my final words are basically the planet is large and full of viruses. So this is probably something like this could happen again. And literally every paper that I've seen has said, this is just one. Right? This is only one virus. So we really need to be thinking about what good control of this looks like. How do we surveil for it? And I would also say this is one of those places where some of the work that people do that maybe seems kind of silly, like I know Sarah Palin made fun of the fruit flies in France, research, But really, bat immunology, right, is like driving the lives of billions of people right now. And so I would also say that not only do we need to have good surveillance, good public health, we also need to have good basic science, understanding kind of the ecology of these viruses, the ecology of the species that carry these viruses, and that will give us better information on how to avoid this in the future. So,
yeah, support good science. I think that's a great final message for sure.
And be nice to bats because they have a secret weapon.
Yes. they know that swab is coming.
Toren has a penguin story.
I do.
Ooh.
What is it?
Well, let's see. It was an outing of penguins as, again, this one's in Kansas, Missouri. The Kansas City Zoo and the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City have made an arrangement where the penguins were allowed to do a little tour of the gallery. I'll include the link in the chat so everyone can watch the video. It's of course delightful. These are Humboldt penguins again, and they've missed their regular interactions with zoo visitors. And they're always looking for a way to enrich their lives and stimulate their days during the shutdown period. So they took them to the art gallery and let them wander around and really appreciate the art, and also the when the museum's director Julian Zugazogoita spoke, for some reason they mentioned that the penguins seem to appreciate the Spanish language. So there's that.
Okay.
So if you see a penguin and you speak Spanish, give it a try and see what happens.
Hola. That's all.
Hola,
It's about all I speak.
penguino. I don't even know. Now I got to look up translate penguin Spanish to English.
Google Translate's not there yet.
Yeah, maybe not. Or pangolin. Could be pangolins.
Pinguina. Pinguina is the Spanish word for penguin.
Oh.
Now we all know.
Oh,
Nice.
That's my penguin story.
Thanks, Toren. I guess that's it. Anybody else have anything that they want to add before we head out?
I received the enormous benefit from the American government by accident, I think.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, good luck with that.
Yeah, so I got a letter yesterday saying that I received $2,400 from the American government. I think it's because I worked in the States for a couple of years, trying to figure out how to get in touch with the IRS to return it, because it's all very confusing. I'm not American. I live in Canada. I work in Canada. I don't know why I had this money. It was direct deposited into my account. So
Wow. Without even asking for it.
You're it.
Yeah. I know. Now I have to figure out how to go about returning it, and I'm just like,
just send them some cotton swabs. They'll be very grateful.
That's right.
It's super bizarre.
Okay, thanks everybody for watching. We're going to do some Jackbox games on my Discord server in about half an hour. We're going to start about 8:30. Once we stop this video, I will throw the Discord server invite into the channel, so if you want to jump in and play with us, you can. We're also going to stream it to Twitch here, so if you just want to watch the game stream, you can do that here on Twitch. Just stick around or hit the follow, hit the bell so you get notified, all that other junk that they ask you to do on all these sites. Dr. Marshall, Katie, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks so much for the info that you've given us. And again, thanks to my two co-hosts, Dr. Rob Tarzwell, Toren Atkinson. We're all over the internet, so you can find us pretty easily just by searching for us. Or check out viraltransmissions.com. I'm way behind on getting the podcast stuff up. I'm so sorry. It's going to happen. Our YouTube channel does have all of the videos up to last week's, however, so you can go there and listen there. Please take care, and also please spread the word about viral transmissions. Don't spread the actual virus. Wash your hands. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. See you next week, Sunday at 7.